Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today's episode wraps up what has been a busy few weeks in the Australian bush for James and I in particular, in pursuit of roaring red deer stags. If you haven't listened yet, please go back to the previous two podcasts from Red Deer Camp, part 1 and 2, and make sure you go back and give them a listen. We touched on a heap of learning curves, some successful red stag hunts in those two podcasts, all from our hunting in South East Queensland. In this week's podcast, I'm joined by none other than my co-host James Doumtsis, plus back by popular demand after his earlier appearance in episode 2, labelled Origins, we have our father, Nick Doumtsis, back for another chat.
How are we, fellas? Happy to be here, but I feel like I'm a little bit late to the party. Congratulations to you, Ayden. You've done really well. And also James, but I'm definitely keen to start this week on the fellows.
So for those joining us in today's episode, we wrap up and report on the final part of our red deer adventure where we hunted here in New South Wales. And as Dad has sort of alluded to there, in this episode, we share the story from what we're calling a mega red deer stag, which you've probably seen by now on our socials. If you haven't, jump on over there and have a look. We're starting to drop a little bit of content in the way of reels and images. We also cover a close encounter with what is going to be a potential giant red stag of the future, hunting red deer in low density environments, our general takeaways from the raw, and much, much more. So we hope you enjoy this podcast. We're also going to touch on the FAQs and do a segment as we normally do. If you have any questions that you want answered by us on the podcast, please send them through to info@twinelements.com.au with subject line FAQ, or simply send us an Instagram or social media DM and we will get back to you there. We have the Twin Elements account, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors and James Doumtsis Outdoors. Without further ado, we will jump straight into the podcast. Are you in the market for serious boots for all feet, terrain and adventures? Well, look no further than Lower Boots. We have been running the Lower Ranger GTX 3s for many, many years now without so much as a blister. The team at Lower have extended their generosity to you, our valued listeners, and supplied us with a unique discount code. Use code TWINELEMENTS10 at checkout for 10% off your next order. Wear Lowers on your next hunt. Your feet will thank you.
So this podcast and the hunting that we jumped into here in New South Wales is just absolute chalk and cheese from what we'd experienced in South East Queensland. And I think for Ayden, it was probably a bit of a shock in the sense that he hadn't really done the South East Queensland hunt. And so for him, having opportunities and seeing so many stags in a day, like seeing up to 10 stags, different stags in a day, but then having to sift through them to try and find the one of quality or that more mature stag was a bit of a learning experience. Whereas what we've been experiencing here down in New South Wales, as soon as I moved to Armidale, I pretty much headed straight down the hill into the Hunter Valley to try and get some access for red deer, and put in a lot of work trying to get access in the last couple of months, and have secured some pretty good properties, but they're all very, very, very low density. So to put it in perspective, like to jump forward, I guess a little bit, we have been hunting one of these places with, I think it's been about a week now. We've seen like 4 red deer. There is the potential, obviously, to shoot ridiculously big stags, as Ayden was successful on, but they are very few and far between, and you do have to put in a lot of work to find them. So what we've been experiencing here is the genetics are incredible, arguably some of the best in the country here in the Hunter Valley. But the densities on these particular places that we're hunting on are very, very low. So what we're sort of seeing is a lot of the time we might be finding stags that are 2.5 years old or 3.5 years old. So, the first heads after them being a spiker, for example, which are already larger than, for example, like Ayden's big mature 6x6 that he shot up in Queensland and already has more points and whatnot. So, it's one of these battles where you obviously don't want to be shooting young stags. You want to be shooting mature stags and letting the young ones grow. So we have had a lot of wicked encounters that we've been able to film and document through some incredible footage of these younger deer. But obviously targeting a mature stag, we've done a lot of searching and eventually Ayden was successful on an absolute giant, which we'll get to in the future.
I think, definitely going from... So this podcast, I guess, takes place where I drove down from Townsville down to Armidale and then went to the Hunter Valley and hunted with James for these red deer for probably, I'd say, around 5 days or so. And then, so there's almost like a part one to this New South Wales hunt. And then we go to Queensland, experience that for about a week where we do the Red Deer Camp podcast that you would have obviously heard by now, and then come back and experience another probably week or so of what ends up sort of feeling like tapering off of the red deer raw for us here in New South Wales. So there are sort of two parts to this, and definitely for me, it was an eyebrow raiser just seeing the potential like animal quality down here, but also it was amazing going from here in New South Wales where I thought the hunting was pretty good the first couple of days that we were here. As you're about to hear, we did see some stags and have some encounters and, see a few red deer, which was definitely exciting for me because I hadn't hunted them personally for around 10 years or so. And then we left here in New South Wales and drove up to Queensland. And immediately on the first night that we'll get there unpacking gear and going through, property boundaries and stuff like that, as James said, like there were deer calling at camp. And to that point, we'd barely heard a roar in New South Wales for 5 or so days of hunting. So that just brings us to this part one, just pre-Queensland, I guess, where we'll dive into some of the hunting and the action.
Yeah, so having got some new access pretty late, sort of in the season, I guess, like sort of early March, we'd done one hunt out there, and to be honest, like the property owner hadn't really seen, like he's like, yeah, I think there's deer in the area, to be honest, mainly fallow, there's a couple of pigs getting around, but no one really hunted it, and so we were going in there like, I don't know, very raw in terms of like previous experience and also, what to expect, which in a lot of ways can be really exciting. And after talking to the property owner, which we'll do a deep dive on sort of breaking down like the first time you go to a property and what to expect, but he showed me around the place so I could get a general feel. And the two main areas of interest for me was there was a paddock that he'd locked up for winter. It was a 7,000 acre property. There's one part where he's locked up the place that's maybe 1,000 acres, it had really good feed. And then there was another part that was probably another 700 acres that also had been locked up for winter that had really good feed. The rest of the property had been sort of eaten out quite a lot because it was quite a hard season in this area. And so those were the two really like sort of main topics and main areas that I wanted to explore. And Ayden and I end up going there for a weekend, and it was pretty miserable conditions, to be honest. Like the whole time it absolutely pissed down rain. We actually broke one of our like 150 to 600 mil lenses, which we obviously very much needed during the rut, which was a bit disappointing. But what we did do is find a wallow, which was really, really exciting for Ayden and I. Like we were like full fist pumps. And it was a really, really good wallow, like one that was well established on this dam. And we ended up setting up in the rain and doing a series of hind calls, and we were able to draw in a spiker, which I think Ayden's posted the clip on our Twin Elements page, but it's like probably the best red spiker I've ever seen in the sense of it actually had tops, like it was a 2x2 and really long spikes, which is just an indication of how good the genetics are here. And also like his tops, I guess, were probably better than my 5x5 that I shot in Queensland, which just indicates like in the future how, like, if you are able to find that 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old red stag, like what you could potentially shoot in this area, which is just exciting to see and sort of, for me, I guess, motivates you to pass up all these younger deer in the hope of one day like that you shoot, I guess, like a truly magnificent giant as Ayden was able to do.
Yeah, so I think it was a little bit misleading having that amazing encounter where we obviously had that spiker come into the wallow. He didn't wallow or do anything like that. But interestingly, he basically stood where we had previously just stood and, inspected this wallow. And I think because of the crazy amount of rain that we're having, it just dampened out any scent. So he stood there at about 8 meters from my location for probably 5 minutes or so, had no idea we were there, just sort of, it was actually pretty cool. He was letting out a few little deer calls, trying to obviously find this hind, just because we were anticipating that the wallow was that freshly used, and with low deer density, it was obviously like a pretty good hotspot. We were hoping something more mature would obviously come in, but to have him come in was just good to see and know that there were red deer in the area. It had confirmed that for us. So we ended up spending the rest of the weekend looking for red deer and didn't see a single other animal after plenty of miles covered, lots of glassing and stuff like that. It was pretty wet and miserable conditions, but it should have been great for animals. Like we did see a lot of pigs and goats and things because they were up on their feet. Like there was no point them, I guess, being bedded down. They would rather be feeding while it was wet and sort of in those more protected gullies. But there was a lot to take from this property that gave us a lot of confidence for sort of the hunts in the future.
We all know that when it comes to great tasting coffee in the outdoors, you look no further than Dog and Gun Coffee. Their preloaded drip filters are renowned for taking cafe-grade coffee into your hunting camp. But your favourite flavours can also be enjoyed at home with their whole bean variety. Use code TWIN10, that is TWIN, 10 the number, to get $10 off your first order. We then moved to a different property, one that I'd scouted a little bit more just because it was a touch closer to home, still like an hour and a bit, but enough that, it was enough to go out for a day or whatever. And we actually had a really, really cool encounter with a stag that we've affectionately called Clubby, where he's got a limp in his back leg, and he's a mature stag, like probably one of the best ones we've seen on the place, and a really nice 14-pointer. But because he was limping in his back left leg, his right antler was slightly shorter, which made him very sort of distinguishable if we were lucky enough to see him again. But the sad thing about this encounter was when we first saw him and glassed him up, we were actually on a ridge looking down over a heap of country, and he was actually over the boundary fence, which sort of restricted this whole setup and probably limited ultimately our success on this hunt, because what we ended up doing was hind calling a couple of times, and he started moving up the fence towards us, which was, obviously really positive and reinforced that he was interested, let out a couple of roars, and Ayden and I quickly sort of moved off the ridge to try and get into a position to be able to call him up over the boundary fence, and I'll let you sort of finish the story, I guess.
Yeah, for me, this hunt in particular, it's a little bit anticlimactic for me because this was probably the biggest red stag that I'd ever seen in the wild, obviously, and to this point, like seeing him, I sort of immediately was like, we've got to make this happen because there's no guarantee we'll see this again. And I think this was only, a few days into our hunt, and I'm sort of here in New South Wales and Queensland and whatnot, hunting this rut raw with James for like a month by now. But I just remember putting a bit of pressure on ourselves, and to be honest, as James sort of said there, it was like less than ideal circumstances, because the way that we had come into the property that we could hunt and had permission on was walking about 1.5 km to get to a vantage point to then hunt this long slither of basically property. And where we saw this stag was right in the corner. So we had the tiniest little play on him. And the fact that I spotted him right on daylight, saw him, and immediately I couldn't see the whites of his antlers because it was so early, but just saw by the mass and the frame that he was a shooter. And as the daylight sort of got on, as soon as we could work out what he was and where he was going, and the fact that he was feeding onto the neighbours, it just confirmed for me that we had to do something then and there in hind call. Whereas ideally, if it was on our property and we had more wiggle room to play with, I would have waited, done a massive loop to get the wind right, and then hunted him sort of more adequately. But yeah, basically, as James said, let out a few hind calls. He was receptive, started roaring and coming into sort of along the fence, getting to a point where, again, with his limp, it was hopefully going to be a bit easier for him to commit and jump over the fence and come into this hind call. So we ducked around, got the wind as best as possible, and we're right on the corner of the fence on our basically side, hoping that he would walk through this little gully and jump the fence into our vicinity. But on the way down, unfortunately, we were going super slow, and again, limited by a very narrow approach. Unfortunately, some kangaroos got our wind to our left and down the hill. And as they do, they sort of took off. And again, this is where, if I knew the property a little bit better and sort of, again, knew how limited opportunities were going to be, I probably would have high and called then and there just to try and keep him interested. Because obviously those roos are taking off. He's probably going, oh, what's going on? I'm a mature animal. Roos don't just take off for no reason. And in hindsight, if I had have called a couple more times because he was interested, it might have just kept him around. And then by the time the roos moved through, he might have gone, oh, okay, I'm going to commit to going into that hind again, and given us a bit of a second chance. Whereas, to be honest, the rationale and my way of thinking, I was like, I don't want this, because the wind was still iffy for our approach. Like, we hadn't quite, the wind was sucking down and we were coming off the top down to sort of where we needed to be on our side of the fence. And again, I didn't want to call and have him come in and then get winded, because I figured I was trying to sum up very quickly in my head, like, what's worse, him winding us and being gone guaranteed probably for the rest of the month. Like, I just figured a stag that was that old and mature, if he winded us, would be gone. Whereas a stag that's, had a couple of roos blow through, we might see him over the coming days, especially if there's some hinds in season. So again, in hindsight, we never saw this stag again. And to be honest, I've hunted enough in my life and had a few encounters particularly that have like haunted me, I guess. And I remember saying to James after that, I kind of was pretty disappointed, because it was, day 3 or something like that of the trip. And I just said to him, I really hope that's not our like one encounter on a big stag, because I knew how much time James had put into scouting this particular block and had just started seeing a few stags. But still, when we say a few stags, it was maybe like 2 of that caliber. And to be honest, the competition on the surrounding properties and even this property, like the reason we had to go to the previous property and found that spiker was because, there were other people hunting this property and shooting stags. So, even to this point, we know of about 3 or 4 mature animals that have been shot. So, but when we say shot, they're shot by rifle hunters. So we're sort of bringing bows to a gunfight, I guess, and trying to target these mature animals. And yeah, as I said, it turns out we never saw that stag again. We never saw Clubby again, which was definitely disappointing. But it's just one of those things that we have to live with our decisions. And maybe I should have hind called, because it might have given us a few extra seconds and changed things up.
Yeah, I definitely think. The good thing about Clubby is he's going to be identifiable. So, although our red deer rut hunt has finished, he well and truly may still be there and may pop up, even though the neighbours have shot, or people in the area have shot a few stags within the vicinity. So, hopefully, I see him again in the future. But I know for me personally, like, I was following Ayden with the camera, and I know when those roos busted through that I definitely straight away, my immediate instinct was to hind call. And that was just purely because he'd responded so positively to hind calls when we were up on the ridge, and we hadn't hind called moving down. So he hadn't, in his mind, the hinds are up above. And then all of a sudden, these roos have busted, and he's got no positive reinforcement against of where are these, what are these hinds doing where I haven't seen them, haven't done anything. And so he's then been like, okay, well, I'm not going to risk it. And I'm going to, piss off and leave. Whereas I genuinely think, given how low the density of the deer are there, and how almost compared to South East Queensland, where hind calls really worked, in these super, super, super low density areas, it actually increases the emphasis and the power and the weight of a hind call, because it's even these stags might walk around for days and not see a hind. And so for you to then pop up and be that beautiful hind sitting up on a ridge, and then, then be able to hear you and be, oh, it's only 200 meters away. I think that really does have a lot of weight and really does have a lot of power of getting these stags in, as we'll talk about in the future. But I actually think it would have been enough to hold him there probably. And I think he could have potentially kept coming in, even though the roos had sort of busted, because it wasn't the roos were sort of off to probably 100, 150 meters away. So it's not like they were right past him. And even if it just held him there and he sort of looked and looked and looked, I think it still would have given us maybe that extra chance that we needed. We were pinned pretty hard between, the corner of the boundary property, which sort of made like what we said, it was the hardest part about this stalk because we were very, very limited on approach and wind and everything like that. But yeah, just knowing sort of the limited opportunities that we had, I would rather have, like I said, my instinct was sort of hind calling, but I was the guy behind the camera, so we didn't get that chance, and we won't see Clubby again for now, but hopefully we can catch up with him again in the future.
I'm just curious for everyone out there, because I was fortunate enough to come out and hear you hind call a spike from a long distance away. I was very surprised. How far was this stag compared to where you guys were set up?
He was probably 250 metres below us. We weren't going like super loud though. We were just doing normal hind calls.
Okay.
But he would he could well and truly. Like we actually had a stag that was further again, like past him, do a roar on like the opposite ridge that would have been 500, 600 away. And that was like us just doing general hind calls. But it was like the first thing in the morning, fairly still, like the birds were starting to go, but it wasn't like Ayden had spotted this stag like in the grey light. And then he'd slowly made, like he was feeding and moving up to us along the boundary fence. So, but yeah, we weren't like throwing out ridiculously loud hind calls, but yeah, they were hearing it from a long way away, and they do. Like they hear them from way longer than what people anticipate and expect.
Yeah, and that's where I think in hindsight, again, this day in particular, as you just said, we had this stag, Clubby, call back to us after literally maybe 2 or 3 hind calls just to test the waters. He responded quite strongly to a roar and then obviously changed his trajectory and came in. Behind him, another 250 metres away, so probably 500 metres from us where we were on the ridge, another stag called that was well on their side of the property and sort of out of range. That we never actually laid eyes on. But then after this experience, we sort of tried not to waste too much time knowing that, it was the best part of the day and what we assumed to be, prime rut, sort of end of March, start of April. So we continued along the ridge and sure enough actually found, it's interesting because we have spoken about this previously on a podcast, but I think James and I both were just super in tune to trying to make the most of any opportunities. And while we were glassing like every available bit of cover, we actually heard what sounded like an antler just scraping slightly on a tree. We weren't sure if it was like 2 young stags sort of clashing their antlers and like tinkering together, but it was quite low volume with very minimal aggression. And as it turns out, we'd sort of ended up locating a very young stag, maybe 3 years old, 2.5, 3 years, but still would have been like a mid 30-inch long sort of stag. But he was a 6x7 that we ended up laying eyes on. And he, quite interestingly, was doing quite a bit of roaring. That's actually how we confirmed that it was definitely a stag after hearing that tinkering of the antlers on a tree. We started dropping down towards him, and sure enough, he just let out a few very, very light moans, basically. And again, because he didn't have that competition, I don't think there was just one hind and a yearling with him. But this was probably the best morning as far as roaring goes for us on our New South Wales hunts. And that was, we had 3 stags roar that we confirmed. Got to obviously see 2, but didn't see the third. And that just goes to show that, in a couple of weeks of hunting here in New South Wales, to hear only 3 stags go in one morning or one day just shows you that quality versus quantity sort of issue that we had to face quite regularly.
Yeah, well, jumping forward, I guess, too, like we've had 3 stags on that morning roar, but then in another, week and a bit of hunting reds, I think we've had 1 other stag roar. So, we've heard 4 stags, whereas like it was nothing, even like you talk about afternoons generally being quieter than mornings. Like, we had, sometimes even 8, 10 stags roaring of an afternoon in Queensland, let alone, the morning hunt. So very much chalk and cheese, but both really rewarding and have the benefits of, their own right in their own different ways. But we, after this 6x7 encounter, we went up the next day to South East Queensland, as you guys would have heard on the previous 2 podcasts. But one thing we did get, which was perfect timing and very lucky, was all our new Ebley stock gear arrived from the US, which we were super pumped about because we had obviously the main frame, which with a couple of different bags each that we were able to test out. The main one was their 5,000, their vapor packs, which Ayden and I have obviously carried out a couple of red deer since getting them now with quarters and all the rest of it, and they've been actually awesome. For me personally, I think the best features that I actually really enjoy is all the clips. Like, it's super customizable, and like the load frame and everything like that, the design of it with the zips. Initially, I thought it was going to be a bit, I don't know, sort of clunky and stuff, but like the easy zip on, zip off, like for the frame, it actually like it's incredible. Like it was a really, really smart and really good design. And the other thing I'm enjoying is probably their sort of comprehensive, I guess, bino harness system, where they've got so many different pockets and pouches and zips and stuff like that. And we've been obviously running it for when we're filming as well, and so being able to have like wipes and put lens caps and lens filters and batteries and everything else in all these different pockets, and carry a camera in my made bino harness, and then be able to be shooting with one in my hand and quickly switch them back and forth and have extra audio gear and batteries and blah blah blah. Like it's been really good, let alone if you're actually the hunter and you've got the bino harness with the binos, being able to chuck like a Wimpuff for your rangefinder, and then a head torch in there, and maybe a little knife or something like that, and run up a mountain at last light. It's been like super, super helpful in terms of being effective in those afternoon hunts. And I honestly think it's probably the best bino harness I've ever had. So really looking forward to testing that out more into the future. Cayuga broadheads. Where do I begin? Ayden and I have just absolutely taken to and love these broadheads. He's shooting the 150 grain Zots while I'm shooting the 150 grain pilot cuts with bleeders. There was no other head that I was going to run in Montana on my limited entry hunt than the pilot cut. And I was so happy when I took down the bull of a lifetime. We've teamed up with Cayuga to get 10% off your next order by using the code TWIN10 at checkout. That is TWIN, 10 the number at checkout, to get 10% off your next order.
So a week then goes by where we're obviously hunting in South East Queensland. We experienced a little success up there, and we come back to New South Wales after that period, basically to no roars whatsoever, and a very, very contrasting situation where we actually struggled for days on end to actually sort of turn up any stags in particular. We had one morning that sort of stands out where we saw a heap of hinds. I think it would have been probably 5 hinds and 5 yearlings, which doesn't sound like that much. But for here, as we're saying, in low deer density, we sort of were like, all right, we found the mecca of deer, and they were sort of in, maybe a 2-kilometre radius. And from our glassing, the reason we sat on this one glassing knob and would get there and do a 1.5 kilometre walk into it, most mornings to get the wind right and then be able to hunt this big parcel of land that we had access to, was purely for this benefit of glassing and looking into all these tight little pockets and trying to find the hinds, because we assumed that if we could find the hinds and drop in on them, hopefully, even if the stags weren't roaring, we'd be able to find, a stag. And if we could get in on the hinds, maybe do a hind call and coax a stag into roaring or coming into us. And it was this particular morning, finally, after watching, the 5 hinds and 5 yearlings for a couple of hours, and to be honest, it's low pressure just because there's low deer density. I don't think a lot of people are hunting this area. We ended up finally finding a young 5x6 stag that, interestingly, wasn't actually with the hinds for the first couple of hours of the morning, and then suddenly sort of popped up on them as we were watching them. And it was cool to watch him. He sort of went about his business and was doing his Fleming response and stuff, but interestingly, never let out a roar, even though he was, right up the tail end of these females, trying to breed with them and stuff like that. But, we ended up letting them go to their bed in the thicker timber, continued hunting all day. We actually shot a few nanny goats for meat just to pass the time during the middle of the day. We were sort of running low on our rations because for the previous few weeks and into southeast Queensland, we were hunting quite a lot and utilising, a lot of mince wraps, bolognese, all these sorts of meals that we tend to love through our wild game that we've acquired. And later on in that afternoon, we'd gone back up to that glassing knob after doing, a few big walks on the place, trying to, coax up a stag or just pass the time looking for animals basically and cover the ground. And then we set up to do a little bit of calling, and this just goes to show how seductive, a hind call can be in low density, because interestingly enough, from probably 700 meters away from where we'd put that young stag to bed earlier that morning, we ended up coaxing him into less than 15 meters that afternoon. And he come in and sort of caught us off guard because he did not let out a single roar again. And yeah, he would have come into less than 15 meters, and I was able to video him on the iPhone, and we've chucked that up on the social media as a reel. So if you want to go back, I think it's date stamped for the 17th of April. It would have been released on our social media if you want to have a look at that young 5x6. But that's an animal that we assume to be maybe 2.5, maximum sort of 3.5 years old, just to give you an insight into how good the genetics are. And to be honest, he's probably comparable in terms of length and size and stuff to the South East Queensland red stag that I shot, that was well and truly, over 7 years old. I'm not sure exactly how old, but super heavy, had very minimal teeth left in his head, and just like an old stag. So it just goes to show sort of how good these deer can be if left to mature.
Yeah, that encounter with that 5x6 in the afternoon when he came in quiet was probably, looking back on the rut, actually interesting, like probably the one that frustrated me the most, because I'd like to say that every single animal that we'd sort of, maybe except for Clubby and stuff, like Clubby was the only animal we didn't capitalize on, but this 5x6 was probably the only animal that we didn't get like really good footage of, in terms of like when there was an opportunity to get good footage, we capitalized really well and got good footage. And this stag had just completely caught us off guard. Like I was probably 10 meters away from Ayden. I think I was like trying to film some other stuff at the time, or film some B-roll. Ayden was glassing. And then all of a sudden, like, and the camera was, the main big camera was probably 5 meters between us, and Ayden like does a little whistle, and I slowly shift my head over, and he's like, "There's a stag there." And I remember just trying to get up to move, and Aiden's like put his hand up to be like, "Don't move." And then, I just see the sort of shadow of this stag, and here he is, like what Ayden said, like 15 meters way below us. And I just think, if lucky, in some ways it's lucky he was only a smaller stag, or a younger stag, because if Ayden had shot him, I would have been proper pissed, not capturing it on film, considering how much, like, just following him around with the camera we'd done to this point, trying to sort of document everything for you guys and share the story. So, it was a little bit disappointed not to get better footage for you guys. Ayden obviously got some great footage on his iPhone, but I was a little bit disappointed I couldn't get some good video footage.
Yeah, I was probably a little bit guilty there, to be honest, because I was glassing and had heard something. I don't know if it was a rock slip or his antler touching a bit of like the dogwood that he approached through. But it was definitely like a metallic sort of sliding, like, clanging sort of sound. And I just thought to myself, like, that's not a kangaroo. And I actually grabbed my bow and brought it closer from where it was sitting sort of just behind me to my right, and brought it more to my hip and leant it against a log. And then I actually quickly saw a bit of his antler coming through the dogwood. And that's when I like whistled to James to be like, "There's a stag here." Grabbed my phone out very quickly because that's all I had with me. And by the time I did that, he was sort of in plain sight of me at 15 meters, and I just hit record. Like, I didn't have time to really explain to James what was going on, who was, as he said, just to my side. But to be honest, if it was a mature stag, I might have been able to put an arrow on the string, but I definitely wouldn't have been able to get to full draw. So again, similar to what James said, it was a thing for me where, because we were at this point getting pretty desperate, we were basically letting out like every half an hour 2 location hind calls just to see if something sparked up, like that previous morning from, like a week or so before at this point when we saw Clubby, and nothing. Like, this stag had not let out a single roar all day, even though he was with hinds, and that sort of leads us into, to be honest, the next morning, which is when I actually take my stag that you would have seen, on the socials lately. And to give it a bit of perspective, I guess, it was a full moon at that period, which, again, I'm not really superstitious and don't know too much about it, but people can associate the full moon with a bit more quiet hunting. We definitely didn't hear any roaring and saw a lot less stag sort of movement, I guess, over those few days. To put into perspective, we hunted pretty hard that morning, and literally found one young fallow buck, which was a bit of a rarity. We hadn't seen another single fallow deer on this property. And anyway, just for a bit of fun, we actually called him into, 4 or 5 meters just to practice a calling situation on a deer, because at that point we were sort of deprived of action.
Yeah, Dad was actually flying in at 10 o'clock or roughly 10 o'clock that morning. And so Ayden and I had just decided we were going to go for a quick hunt and sort of run up this ridge, and then, just be there in case we saw something. We ended up dropping down off the ridge and doing like a sequence of calls and did not see anything. Like, we were both sort of like, tail between legs a little bit, like putting in a lot of work here and just sort of banging your head against a brick wall, it felt like, and just not hearing roars and not seeing deer. Like, it was the first time that morning actually that we were walking out that we hadn't even seen a red deer at that point. Like, normally, I'd guess I'd put in a lot of work to sort of patterning the deer, especially the hinds, and trying to sort of work all that out. And that was like the first day that we were leaving without actually seeing a red deer on this place, which did hurt a little bit. But we obviously had to pick up Dad, and it was funny because I'd actually text my partner Eden and just said, hey, coming home early, we're going to be able to pick up Dad, because I just said to her, is it okay if you grab Dad if we're on some stags or hunting or whatever? And she'd message back, yeah, that's fine. And so we were dropping back off the ridge without service, and to be honest, we got kissed on the dick, and we got lucky, very, very lucky in hindsight. And even now, I think, are still realizing how lucky we got with this situation of what happened. But, that's what happens. You put in a lot of work and eventually luck swings your way.
Yeah, so it's still all very raw, to be honest, because it's one of those things where it's odd. What I'm about to explain, when it actually happened, felt like there was never a doubt that we were going to get this stag. But leading up to it, it was at one of those points where heading back towards the car, we actually said to ourselves, like, we preach it a lot, like if things aren't going your way, try and create your luck. So we actually, did what James does a lot, like pre-scouting, and we ended up doing a big detour to try and go and check out a dam, just to see if there was any sign of wallowing or tracks or anything, just to go, oh, maybe there's a red stag in this vicinity. And to be honest, it was only like 5 or so 100 meters away from the car, but on a line that we sort of haven't really hunted, because we were typically going up this one way to go and then hunt, the majority of the property, which, layout wise was facing another orientation. So again, we were not far at all from the car. The only reason we were there was because we were checking out this dam, and oddly enough, there were quite a few stag tracks around the dam, which we took as good sign, because again, we'd covered tens, if not hundreds of kilometers here on this property over the last, few weeks. And you'd get excited when you'd see a red deer track or a little tiny rub, because you'd go, all right, there's no cows in this paddock, for example. There has to be a red stag in the vicinity, or a spiker at least. And that's where I think the spiker situation is actually quite important to mention here, because we were, dropping down off the ridge, had just checked out this dam, we're walking back towards the car when, to be honest, it sounded like a domestic cow mooing. And both James and I stopped dead in our tracks, and he goes, was that a stag? And I said, it sounded like a cow. And he goes, there's no cows in that paddock. And straight away we looked at each other with our eyes pretty, lit up. And if not a few seconds later, this red deer gave out the most shitty excuse of a moan, but we just knew we were on. And he gave out this little roar just to say, yep, I'm over here. And as it turns out, the only reason that stag roared was because he had the tiniest bit of competition in the form of a red deer spiker. So it's amazing, massive takeaways. We were obviously pretty deprived of hunting experiences and encounters over this New South Wales stint. And for a lot of people, as we've preached many times on the podcast, the buck to doe ratio, or the stag to hind ratio, is super, super important for rutting activity. And it would have been easy for us if a spiker walked past to nail it at 12 meters, because they are super susceptible to a hind call. But the fact that we try and leave them in this instance obviously paid out dividends, because that spiker that ended up being around this, we're assuming mob of hinds, we never saw them, but was enough to actually create a bit of competition for this stag to get frustrated, obviously, and then let out a roar to say piss off, which we've obviously located him with.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough the importance of spikers. They are the downfall of many a big stag and big bucks in my mind, because they are, they're just a royal pain in the ass, to be honest, and they're very easy to shoot. And like we say, we're here to educate. We're not here to preach and tell people what to do. But for me personally, I will never shoot spikers for meat, especially if you're new to hunting and you haven't shot anything, man or woman, go your hardest and shoot, whatever you can successfully and ethically get. We're not trying to limit people here, but it's we see so many people during the rut that want to stock the freezer with meat, and I get that. But it's go and shoot a hind, or especially in my situation for red deer, even I wouldn't shoot a hind either, because my, like I said, we've got 5 hinds on this whole place. It's, I think, 6,000 acres of hunting that I've been able to see and locate. So it's I'm not going to go and shoot my breeding stock either. The property owner is happy with them there. He doesn't want me to, get rid of them. If he did, it'd be a different scenario. But I'm not going to shoot them either. So on this place, everyone in the area, and I'm lucky that the people that surround it, like what we said, there's been some really good stag taken, but we're all in the same boat in the sense that there's not really the deer density that we're sort of looking for. And we're all just hunting mature stags. Yes, it does hurt a little bit when someone else shoots, a stag that you might be chasing or have a bit of a relationship or story with, but you're also happy for that other hunter. And equally, I'm just grateful that everyone else is only targeting big stags rather than just shooting sort of these younger, incredible genetic heads that we've got running around the place. So, but yeah, like I said, definitely can confidently say we would not have got this stag that Ayden was lucky enough to shoot if that spiker wasn't there. So, if you're not new to the game and you're just looking to fill the freezer, go and shoot a mature buck or a mature stag, or go and shoot a doe or a hind if you've got the numbers there to do so.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're pretty much trudging along, just scouting and checking out the area, and then this half-assed roar happens, and from there we just switched into go time. And to be honest, it was pretty textbook, pretty efficient, everything that played out after this. Looking back, it was just one of those things that every little decision that we made leading up to that stag hitting the deck was just textbook and perfect, and I wouldn't change a single thing. To be honest, except for maybe enjoying it a little bit more, because I'm not going to lie, I was a little bit nervous. But from there, we didn't actually think the stag was too far away, just because that moan was only pretty half-assed and it didn't sound too quiet. So we assumed that he was probably maximum 300 meters away, if not less. So pretty quickly we set up, I checked the wind, knew which way I'd been going, because the wind on this place was pretty consistent for most of the trip. And fortunately for us, we were hunting on a bit of a crosswind back to the car. So we quickly cut up the ridge, got things sort of in our face. And then from there, I didn't want to actually risk it by getting in too close. I figured that with the allure of the hind calls over the previous few encounters with all these stags, I was confident that from where I thought he was going to hear it. So pretty much at the first really good cover, which ended up being this little stand of these white poplar gums, and there was a bit of a mix of ironbarks on the edge of, this little ridge as well. I just said to James, we're going to set up here and I'm going to call him in, and he sort of gave me the nod. We took our time to really pick a good stand, and looking back, it worked out perfectly again, because this tree had about 4 or 5 different sort of limbs that come off it. So not only did it give me really good cover standing in front of it, but just to the side of it, James had his own little bit of cover, and then behind him from the same tree had a lot of really good vertical cover blocking his outline. So it was absolutely perfect. Both of us were sitting there with really good filming scenario, and we'd sort of identified again, as we do, okay, that's 12 o'clock, that tree directly in front of us. We both identified it. That's 12. If he comes in anywhere else, if I see him first, I'm going to mention where he is. If you see him first, you just say 3, for example, if he's on our right, or 9 if he's on our left, sort of thing. And this is just a system that we've set up in place to make sure that we're both on the same page, because I'm looking through the peep sight, he's looking through the viewfinder in this scenario. We want to make sure that our communication's dialed. And it's interesting because as good as our communication was, we nearly got fluffed, because to be honest, we had awesome visibility. I'd let out a few hind calls at this point, pre-ranged everything, had the arrow on the string, like ready to go. This stag, if it comes in, and we haven't laid eyes on it yet, if it's a shooter, it's dead, like is our mentality, because we've hunted so hard and we're not letting this opportunity go to waste. We've learnt from Clubby earlier in the week, and we gave him a few hind calls to try and get him interested. And straight away, he's roared back. And James and I both looked and were like, yep, it's on. Like, he's interested. Gave him a couple more hind calls, and he roared again and had closed the gap, And this is happening over a couple of minutes, but every time we hind called, he was coming closer. So it was absolutely amazing. And that sort of gets to the point when it got a little bit confusing, and not in the sense of it didn't change anything from our perspective, but basically the first sign that he was getting close was when we saw this kangaroo hopping towards us at like 100 meters. And I watched it hop from right to left and had seen a deer at that point.
Yeah, so I think just jumping back a little bit first, we gave some hind calls and he didn't respond for about a minute. Like there was just silence, and me and Ayden are like, okay, what's here? And we're pretty confident that he could hear us. And so we just held tight, like held position, and then gave another sort of couple of hind calls, and then that's where he roared back. And as soon as he roared back, I was just like, this is on. Like he can hear us. He's responding like this is, and then we gave a couple more hind calls, and then he roared again. And I was like, yeah, here we go. Like shit is going down. And then that's when the kangaroo came through. And I then looking straight down like the tree that we'd identified at 12 o'clock, I was like, I said to Ayden, I'm like, 1 o'clock, there's a stag coming. And so I'm trying to look in the viewfinder to ID this stag and start filming this stag as he's coming in and approaching. And he was over like a little bit of lip where I could only just see sort of from maybe the base of his neck up to his head and then his antlers. But I was looking through some like spindly stuff, and because I was filming, like we don't carry binos when we're filming, so I'm just trying to find him in the lens. And then I'm trying to find him, and then Ayden actually said to me, he goes, oh, there's a stag at 11 o'clock. He's like, it's coming through past the tree that was at 12. And where I'd seen the stag was probably 70 meters past that tree. And so this is like honestly a couple of seconds later. And I said to Ayden, like, shit, he is covering ground. Like, get ready. Like, and then I better let Ayden carry on from here. But
yeah, or it's not my story to tell. It's the whole, and that's where it's pretty interesting because I just happened to be the lucky one that had the bow in this instance. But, to be honest, James had put in so much groundwork, securing these properties, doing the scouting, all of that type of stuff. So it just was lucky that I was the one that had the bow in this instance. And we're pretty selfless in the sense of both of us are super happy to film and hunt and whatever it may be. But again, like straight away, we kind of got to this point where I'm like, didn't you say right? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, there's definitely one on the left. So at this point, we're like, shit, there's 2 stags racing in. And as it turned out, one of them was a spiker, which was coming in sort of to our left of 12. And then the stag, which I hadn't seen at this point, was coming in on the right. And we're pretty fortunate where the stag that was on our right took a slightly more direct route. And I think that's just because he was throwing his body around and the aggression, obviously, and had probably subtly said to this spiker, like, stay there, I'm going to check out this hind, like, I'll kill you. And again, as soon as this stag crested the little ridge, and again, we picked our spot perfectly. There was a little bit of open cover that he'd crossed. And then as he come up over the ridge, we had plenty of time to see him and identify his antlers. And straight away, I had a gut feeling that it was a shooter. But just because it's not my property, and, I wanted to obviously do the right thing by James, like I know what type of thing he's trying to set up here. And because it is extremely low density, we'd had the discussion personally that, if we didn't think it was a shooter and was a really young stag with great genetics, that we'd pass him up and stuff like that. So you'll actually hear in the footage, I asked James essentially for permission to shoot him and say, like, do you think he's a shooter? And he gave the all clear, which was a relief to me because this stag, like, looked a treat coming in. To be honest, I saw his left antler. So as he was approaching me to the right-hand side of his face, I could just see tines and white and antlers and this massive, 4-point crown. And basically he was a nice 7-pointer on that side. Absolutely perfect antler essentially. And then on his right antler, the left as he was running in towards us, I was a little bit confused, to be honest. I knew it had heaps of mass compared to anything that I've sort of seen previously in terms of red deer. But I wasn't sure if the top of his antler was bladed or something. That's what I actually assumed it was. So then I kind of was like, oh, if he's bladed, he's probably got a bit of age. And, I'm trying to assess all of this in, this microseconds essentially. And fortunately for us, we're hyper-focused. But to be honest, I think if I have to be honest, this stag felt dead to me the second that he actually roared back and started coming into this hind call. I think the situation, and maybe that's giving credit to our South East Queensland scenarios and just sort of hunting really well over there. In reflection, I was a lot more nervous when that 6x6 from Queensland came in and took a really long time to come in and make his way up to me, and where I ended up shooting him at 7 meters. So this stag, the fact that the wind was perfect and the way that he was running in and it was fairly visible and stuff, I was just a lot more relaxed. And he ended up coming in to around 25 or 30 meters from me and just sort of let out this final roar, which was super cool to just hear. It was a lot more sort of angst in it, but still, not super aggressive or anything like that. Then proceeded to keep coming in, which was great. And by this stage, we hadn't hind called for a little while now because I just wanted him to wander in the general direction without knowing exactly where we were. So he kept coming in. As soon as his head went behind this big tree, I drew back, and it was pretty textbook, to be honest. I remember talking about the hunt after with James, and he was like, when you drew back behind that tree, he was like, yep. I just there's like little factors and things when it's just like, yeah, when you're like in tune with the scenario and everything that's going on. And yeah, as soon as he come through that tree, he kept coming in, and I would have loved for him to come in closer and closer. But to be honest, I was a little bit mindful of the filming scenario, and I knew that he was going from our right to left and James was on my right. So I basically consciously went, yep, he's coming into a more or less quartering on slightly not broadside, but getting close to broadside situation. I'm going to try and pull him up here with a hind call. Like, I was already at full draw. My pin was chasing him the whole time. And I just chose a time when he went in between these two little bits of spindly brush and basically settled the pin and released as I pulled him up with that hind call. And fortunately I did at that time because James was sort of running out of windows to film him on. He'd actually swapped from filming over my right shoulder to left shoulder pretty perfectly at the same time that I'd hind called. And as I said, I settled that pin, squeezed off the release, and that arrow punched through and struck him pretty hard in the shoulder and pretty low, right into his heart, I imagined. And the stag, it was pretty impressive. He jumped up like crazy and then made a mad dash of about 30 meters or so. And by that point, I'd sort of watched him obviously run and pull up at 30, and the shot felt super good. I was pretty confident I'd hit him through the heart. So I actually gave out a few hind calls similar to that situation in South East Queensland, where I try to, just let him know hey, there is a hind here. There is a reason why you came in here. Just relax. You've heard this big crack of the broadhead going through your scapula. You're probably a little bit fired up, but I just did those hind calls as a bit of an instinct, trying to relax him. And it's amazing in the footage. You actually see it super, super clear, just because James actually had a lot better visibility and was able to track the stag as he ran off after the shot. And as I said, about 30 meters away, you see the stag pull up to these hind calls, and his ears pin back straight away to this hind call. And then from there, he basically does this half little semicircle on that spot, falls down, and his antlers, clash amongst the rock and debris and everything. And I was pretty chuffed, and I'd probably, again, trying to keep everything intact and not celebrate too early, but I was confident I'd heart shot him. I didn't actually see him go down. The footage that you'll see is totally different angle and perspective to what I had. I just heard him go down. Whereas James was sort of still filming him, and I'd turned around because I could hear foot patter coming in, and the spiker that was coming in from, the left of that 12 o'clock originally had kept coming into those three hind calls that I'd just given to the relaxed stag. And it was pretty cool, to have the stag of my dreams basically go down within 30 meters after a perfect shot. And then, this young spiker that was his competition and pretty much the reason this stag was on the ground, run into 10 meters or so, and James swung around, filmed him, and he's probably going, where's this hind? What is happening? Why is he down on the ground? What is going on? But it's just, yeah, the very nature of the red deer raw and why it's so addictive. And yeah, it was just an absolutely incredible encounter. And again, like I owe a lot to James, and like we embraced once that spiker had run off and we'd, confirmed with the optics that the stag was there. We could see his antlers laying down about 30 meters away, 40 meters away. And yeah, it was just one of those bow hunting accolades where, again, it felt very similar, oddly, to when I was filming James in America. And after a long period of time, we'd finally achieved this mutual goal. And again, like I was the one in this instance that shot the stag, but similarly to, I imagine, when James shot the bull elk in Montana, there's this moment or realization that like, hey, my best mate's with me right here over my shoulder, and it could have been either of us that, pulled the trigger and achieved this goal.
Interestingly enough, I need to be honest because we, like when he was coming in, and one thing that really shocked Ayden and I was just the size of this stag when we actually went up to him when he was on the ground. So coming in, I actually, like Ayden said, do you think he's a shooter? And I'm like, yep, like looking at him through the viewfinder. And then as he sort of came in and gave that last roar and stuff, and I was looking at him, I was like, I don't know how, like, I think honestly, and we've sort of discussed it, we think he was probably 5.5 to 6.5 years old. So, it's, he's not a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old deer. Like looking at his teeth and looking at, like his coronets and stuff like that, like he did potentially have more, or he definitely had more growing in him, but not to say like he's still the biggest red deer that Ayden and I have seen. And so like over in that sense, like I'm stoked that he took him, but it was like, I actually whispered to Ayden just before, and did you hear it when I said, I was like, oh, Ayden. And I was actually going to say like, what do you think and stuff. And then 2 seconds later was when he hind called and actually shot him. And like I said, like in hindsight, I'm over the moon because, we have grinded now for another week or so and had very, very, very limited opportunities. And so to be able to capitalize on this one and especially get a stag of this caliber on the ground, like I'm over the moon for Ayden. And like he said, like, I mean, it easily could have been me there standing with the bow and pulled the trigger and, had this magnificent stag. But in a lot of ways, I'm actually probably happier that he got to shoot it because me obviously being more local, like I can hunt them, even though it's harder outside of the rut and keep putting in the work and keep researching, but also hopefully, get a stag of that caliber. But yeah, for him to be able to come down here and get one was just incredible to see, and especially get on film to show you guys. But I did nearly tell him not to shoot it, and I'm very happy that he didn't hear it and that he ended up shooting it because as you guys will see in the footage and obviously have probably seen from photos on social media, he's a giant. Like he's for a lot of people, he's a once in a lifetime stag. And hopefully for Ayden and I, if we keep putting in the work and keep doing this research and stuff, we can have more opportunities on stags like that, and especially passing up these younger ones, as you've sort of heard and as we'll get into more. But yeah, there's plenty of them out there. You've just got to be prepared to put in the work. And as we just got lucky on this day and we did everything perfect and we could capitalize.
Yeah, I'd be lying because I personally wouldn't have asked. I don't think if I didn't think there was a chance that you would have said don't shoot him. And I obviously wanted to do right by you. And as much as, I respected your decision. And when you said like, if you had have said don't shoot him, I would have respected your decision and not drawn back and just enjoyed the moment for what it was. I think in hindsight, after having this last week following that stag where I sort of followed you around with the camera and you've hunted a few different places and put in more time, and we've had a few encounters with other stags and deer and things like that. I think as a greater like perspective, having done this last week and really just, put a lot of work in for very little return, I think it has made it a lot more sweeter as well. Because really, aside from Clubby, that stag that we mentioned earlier, that was another 14-pointer. He's by far, the best stag that we've seen over this whole month period that we've hunted. And there's just so much character to him. Like his left and right antlers are completely different. He's got this, speaking to him specifically, he's got on his right antler this really wonky down-horned sort of brow tine, the down-turned brow tine, which is pretty cool. His right antler in general is so much heavier, but interestingly, he's gone and snapped off nearly every single tine on that antler. So he's quite large in his antler department, and his left antler is pretty much perfect, a really nice 7x7. But then his right antler, all the tines are busted. And he's still got a lot of length to his tines and spellers or whatever you want to call them. But it's just interesting. Like, he would have been scrapping somewhere for a significant amount of time and been a bit of a brawler, because even when we were butchering him and taking all the meat and everything like that, like, he had pretty significant bruising on his hams, which again tells us probably that there's a bigger stag out there somewhere that's, bashed him. And, what the spiker was to him as a, insignificant sort of, threat, he was probably to another stag somewhere. So that's the excitement, obviously, for James to now hopefully go out over, the winter months and pre-scouting for next year and stuff like that over the summer months when they velvet, and to try and find some of these big boys that are out there still. Originating in Texas, USA, Numa Outdoors has formulated a durable, breathable, quiet and comfortable camouflage lineup for all terrain, seasons and pursuits. You may have seen us across our socials running the new Renegade lineup in our recent Northern Territory adventures. That's because the Renegade lineup is perfect for early season, hot and humid conditions in the heat. We're pleased to announce that the Numa camouflage lineup is stocked exclusively by Venture Hunting and Outdoors here in Australia and available now. Head to their website to check out the whole range today.
And so after Ayden and I obviously didn't make it to the airport to pick Dad up, we ended up carrying out a whole heap of meat from this stag. Firstly, because he was still in fairly good condition, but because we were so close to the car, we took the opportunity, just because Ayden and I in our households, we eat a shitload of game meat. So we ended up taking both back legs, one front leg. The other one was pretty much destroyed from Ayden's Zot and Day 6 shaft. Like, just the amount of bruising and stuff in there wasn't worth taking after all the trimming we were going to have to do. Like, I mean, to be honest, we might have been able to take a shank, but that was pretty much it. And then we ended up taking, like, deboning and taking all the neck meat. Obviously took the back straps, took the tenderloins, and took that other front leg. So we pretty much just left a front leg and the spine, and that was it, which was awesome, because we've been able to, mince a lot of it, cut some of it up for crumb steak, a lot for just steaks and slow cooking and stuff like that. And so we're able to fill the freezer, and we've been able to eat it, between Ayden, Dad and I, a fair bit of it just in the next following weeks during the rut. And had some really good game meat. Like, we turned the bit of a backstrap and tenderloin straight into a stir fry pretty much that night. And once again, it was incredibly surprising, like, how tender and how good he was to eat, because normally, big red stags, especially ones that have been rutting and stuff. Like, I think, what was the date when you actually shot him?
I think Dad flew in on the 12th, so it would have been the 12th of April.
Yeah, so there you go. So, I mean, the 12th of April, so we're sort of getting on, considering I was seeing more rutting activity between the 20th of March and 25th of March than we did, for example, seeing between sort of the 10th of April to the 15th of April, and you'd expect they'd be rutting more. So for him to eat so well was a bit of a surprise, but yeah, he was definitely delicious.
It's funny because it really debunks the theory where you need to hang a mature stag for a couple of days. We got straight into him and he's been eaten beautifully. We've had 3 or 4 different dishes now, so it's been enjoyable.
Yeah, it's one of those things, I think, by being able to hang the meat and, obviously get it cooled and all that type of stuff, it's going to just enhance the flavour and reduce any gaminess and give it the best chance of tasting better and being tender and all these sorts of things. But for what we were doing, obviously slicing it super thin and stir frying it on a high heat and then removing it and adding it to the stir fry later on, adding some teriyaki sauce and veg and whatnot. It hit the spot. And again, with the mince, it's something where you can use any meat really, and by the time you add some taco seasoning or bolognese sauces and things like that, we've discussed it at length in previous podcasts, but it's stuff that we live on essentially. But getting back to the hunt and the next few days, as we said, we sort of jumped in and I took the opportunity to try and repay the favour and film James doing a bit of hunting. Dad was also with us, and just because we were trying to cover ground, assess new properties. We basically sent him off on his own to go and enjoy himself and try and find his own red stag. There is always a possibility of a boar or a big billy goat or fallow buck or something like these on these properties as well, because as we've sort of discussed, they're massive parcels of land, being between that probably 5 to 10,000 acres in a lot of instances that James has access to. But you really do have to put in the time and effort, not only covering the countryside with glass, but also putting boots to the ground and trying to find these deer.
Yeah, we've certainly put in a lot of work. I know for me, pre-rut especially, like trying to just as much, probably sometimes to the detriment of my relationship with my beautiful partner, but like just, yeah, especially all of March. Like I can't even think how many days. It was honestly ended up being probably 18 to 20 days during March that I was out there, just because a lot of these places that I got access to was like very late in the piece. And I knew Ayden and Dad were coming and just wanted to sort of do the rut justice, I guess, and try and cover the country as much as we could, and just have as much sort of pre-planning and scouting and opportunity for success as we could during the rut. And obviously it paid off with Ayden getting his incredible stag. But this place, once again, we hadn't really done a lot of work on, and we'd identified sort of one gully being the best gully for red deer, and it was, Ayden and I were down in there, and the amount of rubs and feed was incredible. Like there's obviously a lot of red deer using it. Sort of sadly, once again, it is up against the boundary fence, so we're sort of limited for entry points, which means we're hunting like a pretty shitty crosswind most of the time. But we were down in there, and it was probably 9:30 in the morning. We had seen a lot of sign, but hadn't seen any red deer, and we set up in a pretty good spot where we, it was an open bench. There was a shitload of rubs, really good for feed, and we started giving out a couple of hind calls, and we'd sort of done one, I guess, volley of hind calls where we'd maybe done 8 to 15 hind calls over probably 20 seconds, and I looked up through a gap about 100 meters away and saw a pretty solid black and white boar just cruise through, and I looked at Ayden and said, he's a pretty good pig in this little tussock bench, and said, like, what do you think? Should we go up there and stuff? Knowing that we'd just sort of like, we're in a good spot. There's a lot of sign, and knowing the risks, I guess, but also knowing and having a bit of confidence in our abilities to sort of, I guess, adjust on the fly. And if something did come in or whatever, and end up deciding, let's go for this pig. And don't regret the decision, but obviously in hindsight was a bit of a silly one. Once again, probably got a little bit lucky in the sense that we ran up there, and no sooner did we get to the next little opening did we look up and see a red stag sort of cruising towards us. And he was an 8x7, but honestly, I think he was probably 2.5 years old. Like he was very young, and looked very young. If he wasn't 2.5, he would have been 3.5. There was no way that it was older than that. But just knowing the genetics in this area, this region of the Hunter Valley, like there are some truly big stags that get shot in this area, and he came in, and to be honest, like Ayden actually whispered to me, like, should we kneel down? And I remember just thinking, like, no, we're going to back our camo in here, and we're just like, no, we'll stay, and then we end up just staying upright. And this stag, I'm not going to lie, like he was picking us out, like he could see that we were sort of a bit odd and stuff, but he would like he was sort of looking for these hinds, and he'd be like, oh, what's that? And then keep walking. And long story short, he ended up coming in from about 100 meters away, and walking up to about 25 meters and start sniffing a tree and stuff, in which case, like if he actually was a shooter, like would have been able to easily put an arrow on the string and draw back and shoot him, because there was plenty of cover blocking his head. But yeah, he was an extraordinary stag. Like he had, basal snags and extra points coming off everywhere, and like split tops. And, like if this stag can get to 8 years old, like he will be a giant, which, is part of the reason I know for me, why I do it, because I don't know, like I've hunted South East Queensland, for example, a couple of times. And it is a lot of fun going and hearing 10 stags roaring in a valley. But I feel like it takes a pretty special kind of insanity in person to walk around during the rut and not see deer or not hear roars or anything like that, in the chance that one day you do find like a stag of a lifetime. And I think just with where I know, I don't want to talk on behalf of Ayden, but I know where I've got to personally with my bow hunting now. Like I'd probably rather just target one ridiculously big animal than go and shoot, like a heap of other animals and whatnot. And so there was a little bit of conflict with me personally when we did go to South East Queensland, because, in a little bit in the back of my mind, I was thinking like we do have the potential to shoot these big deer, closer to home. So there was a bit of conflict there, but yeah, hopefully in the future, if I keep doing, plenty of research and whatnot, and putting in the miles and the time, then I will have an opportunity at one of these sort of once in a lifetime giants that, do roam in these vast hills in the Hunter Valley.
Yeah, it was really cool to see this young stag. And again, like we knew he was young because he was probably only 25, maybe 30 inches long. And when we say that he was an 8x7, he was probably realistically more of like a 4x4 frame, if not 5x5. But the fact that he had like 2 or 3 basal snags and all these split tines on his like trays or main beams and stuff, is what gave him like that genetic proponent where we knew it was, being young and just a lot of genetics coming out because, again, we'd seen that spiker earlier in the piece, long time ago, but that spiker that had tops, and that just tells you, that you're dealing with deer that have, massive upside. So it was pretty cool to see that. And again, get that boost of confidence that, yeah, we are doing the right thing, passing up on these young deer. And again, like it was interesting to sort of try and reflect and go, yeah, how old is my deer? And again, I'm super stoked that I took him. I think most hunters, especially bow hunters out there, would be. And just the fact that he came into 20 meters and there was a clean, ethical kill definitely gives everything bonus points. But there's definitely an allure now that we're sort of working it out. And I know that James is going to get super addicted, and next year's Raw hopefully will be bigger and better, and hopefully we get more encounters on these young stags that we're passing up. And it'll be interesting to see with, another winter time and then a summertime when they're in velvet and stuff like that, just how closely James can, I guess, keep tabs on these deer. And especially if he gets, like we've got some Leopold gear coming in, and if he can get his spotter coming in and lined up, hopefully just target these deer and be able to go, oh, okay, that's, Clubby, for example, he's back with his, larger right antler or smaller left antler or whatever it is, and really almost create a bit of a catalogue as to watching these deer as they mature, similar to what we see and sometimes hear about with guys in the States where they watch, certain whitetail go from a 3.5-year-old that looks massive to a 5.5, 6.5 deer that's just totally different dimensions.
And I guess that is the exciting thing. Like with great genetics, there is huge potential for these young stags. And I mean, it's fantastic just watching them, in these close quarters, like less than 30 meters, and getting really cool footage, which, we've had a couple of encounters like that. But that was pretty much it for the red deer for us. Like we then spent another week sort of, roaming the hills and, put in a lot of work, did a lot of location roars, a lot of location hind calls. Didn't really see any more red deer. Like it was pretty demoralizing, I guess. Like there was a lot of kilometers walked. Me, Ayden and Dad actually went on what I would like to call as like a massive death march, where I think the last time I checked, it was like we're up to like 38,000 steps for the day, just trying to cover country and find deer. Like we were just moving, doing location calls, get on ridges, glassing, moving, and could not turn up a red deer at all. We saw a couple of fallow deer, a couple of bucks, which was pretty cool, but could not turn up a red deer, which was a little bit, I don't know, it's sort of hard when that happens, when you're putting in the work and you're sort of banging your head against the wall thinking, not that you deserve anything in life, but you put in the work and you hope that you get opportunities, and we just weren't given them. And I think it does really highlight and sort of emphasize like how much more happy, and I'm sure Ayden is as well, that he actually, he shot his stag, because we've put in the work since. Not that we didn't put it in before, we'd done a lot of work before it as well, and to be able to get a stag of that caliber on the ground, like it was a very special moment for Ayden and I. But since then, we've been pretty lucky. We've been able to capitalise on a couple of handy bores too. I know my one. It was last light, and we'd gone to a new area looking for some red deer and seeing if we could hear anything. And we were moving along a bench with honestly probably 10 minutes of light left, sort of just slowly moving between the roos and look up and saw a boar maybe honestly 50 meters away over a little bench, and I had to sort of scare a few more roos just gently, like they knew we were there, and we were just sort of moving through, and they sort of hopped off, and the boar just kept feeding. And anyway, I looked at him, and he had a bit of white hanging out the side of his jaw, and had a ripped ear, and he looked the part, and so I was able to stalk in there pretty quickly, to be honest, because there was not a lot of cover, and where he was and was going to risk moving out of. I sort of capitalised on the moment and got in there to about 25 metres, and he came out and fed broadside and pulled back and settled the pin, and sent the pilot cut and day 6 shaft straight through. Like, couldn't have picked a better line, really. Like, as soon as the arrow went through, like, didn't get a ridiculous amount of peno. Like, there was the fletchers hanging out on the other side, but he as soon as, like, you could just tell he was in trouble, because looking back at the video, like, you can see blood just starting to pump out immediately. And he did this big death run where he probably ran about 70 meters, and the blood trail was actually insane. Like, there was just blood everywhere, like the old tomato sauce bottle sort of just sprayed across the ground. And I'm surprised he'd made it so far, but he was a pretty solid pig, and definitely happened to just be able to capitalize on a pretty quick little stalk. Option Archery makes specialist hunting gear. I'll never not be able to use equivalizer again. They're truly one of my favourite bits of kit. It combines a stabilizer and equivalizer to increase the functionality of my hunting strategy. It enables me to put my bow on my shoulders, which enables me to glass more when I'm out in the field. Shop both equivalizers and their option sight range today by heading to the website.
So you've heard from James and I at length here. We've got Dad as well, who's obviously come with us and done a few of his own hunts over the last few days. So I figured we'd give him the headlight at the moment, or the spotlight, I should probably say, and give him an opportunity to discuss maybe his takeaways and some of the things that he's obviously witnessed over the last few days. So we'll give him the opportunity.
I feel privileged being here with you guys on this trip and recapping your stories, and your success has been amazing. But I've actually had a few takeaway moments myself. I was surprised one particular setup when James was hind calling, and how patient we were, and then we were rewarded with a spiker coming up, and he'd come from a fair distance away, and how loud he was actually doing it. I was thinking it was insane, but what he was trying to get through to me was sometimes they're at such a great distance that you need to do that, and they do cover a lot of area quickly. And a little bit on what I touched on earlier, I was definitely surprised with the table fare with Ayden stag. It was absolutely delicious, and I've had venison for a very long time now. Happily to say I turned 60 last year and still enjoying my wild meat. But I normally, this is the first time that I've had venison where we didn't actually hang it. So, it's been amazing. The other thing that sort of comes to mind was we did a fairly long walk. I don't know how many Ks we did, but we got up at 3:30, walked in the dark with head torches, got to a particular bench, waited for the sun to come up. We glassed another area, and then we got back to the car with the head torches in the dark. And all that time, to James's credit, he said, look, we did a long walk, and he said, look, on my apps, I can see there's a bench 400 metres up, and I'm rolling my eyes thinking, no more, could we please go home? We end up bush bashing. We got to the bench, and funny enough, we come to this little protected pocket where we come across, I think, 3 or 4 hinds with a yearling and a spiker. And that's the scenario where we got to call him in, and it yeah, it was just a beautiful little pocket where it was out of the wind, it was protected, it had some water for them, and plenty of grass because there was no cattle in that paddock. So it just goes to show that if you study hard enough and get to have the same scenario time and time again, you can look at your map and say, yeah, that looks like a really prospective hunting spot. Actually, I have to give credit to James because it ended up coming out exactly how he anticipated, and it was, a nice way to cap off a very long day.
I think in that scenario, it's just through trial and error, to be honest, and it can be the same. Like, I don't think that I'm like, it's interesting as a hunter. I think the more things and more features within animals that you observe, it obviously makes you a better hunter. Like, so trying to break down, like, why is an animal there on this particular day? What features and aspects, like, because animals do things for a reason. Like, they're not like us where they can just waste energy because they've got like endless amounts of energy and endless amounts of time, like what we do. Like, they are very particular in every single action, other than maybe mating, where you can argue that like a roaring red stag is utilizing a lot of energy, but even then, like, he's trying to pass on his genes and stuff like that. And so, like, trying to, like, I've found that even with like fishing, for example, where like I would say that I'm a pretty bad fisherman, but it's the same with fishers in the sense that like fish are the same where they're like in certain places for reasons. So it might be to do with the wind and the tides and the moon phases and blah, 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 that's, pushes up the bait into a certain spot. And that's why. And so like I've been able to pull things across into my fishing, and it's because I think that I'm a quite observant hunter, that then it makes me think about features that in fishing that like, you don't even normally probably think about, if that makes sense. Like, I'd say for my level of fishing knowledge, like I'm a very, like I'm a crap fisherman. Like, and so, but I think just having that sort of mindset, it's like, okay, well, what features are determining animals' movements and behavior and stuff like that. And if you start thinking about that, whether it is you're hunting or you're fishing or you're spearfishing or whatever, then your success goes up exponentially. And so for me, like what Dad was saying, like the decision to go into that gully system, even though we were completely rat shit and we'd done probably 20 Ks, plus Ks at that point, was because that I knew there was no cattle in there, which was with the red deer. Like, they're large animals, they need really good feed. So that was like having good feed in there because there was no cattle and sheep in there was a big decision. But it was also a very well tucked out of the way gully that I hadn't been into yet. And it just made sense in places that I found previous deer on these properties that there should be deer there. And I'd never been there before. And I mean, we had to walk like an extra K. And then, like Dad said, we had to climb up over this hill and bench to get into this sort of little hidden gully. But looking at maps, they had good cover. They had a dam there. They had really good feed because there was no thing. And, we came up over the hill and gave a location roar, and yeah, straight away, end up seeing the spiker chasing one of the hinds around, which I just straight away, I'm not going to lie, I was pretty excited because I thought it was a stag. And then pretty quickly got my heart broken and was demoralized, considering it was our last afternoon to be hunting reds. And when I noticed it was a spiker with a couple of hinds and a yearling. So that is how the game goes. But I know for me personally, like I've said, like I'm more than happy to have been following these guys around with the camera for most of the rut. Yeah, I do obviously have this access not too far from home. So you can definitely go out and try and start patterning these reds and hopefully some fallow in the future, and just keep getting access and putting in the work. Like it sounds like these properties have just fallen in our lap, but I can say, these properties have come from me doing a lot of days of driving and working things out and talking to different property owners and trying to get access and stuff. And I've had 10 times more no's than I've had yes with getting these properties, but every so often you get lucky. And then even then, once you find the place, then putting in the work to scout it and learn as much as you can about if there is even deer there, and if there is deer where they live. Because as I can say, like we've been to some of these places, multiple times now and seen like less than 5 red deer. So, we can't say that, yes, we are getting some very good, we got a very good stag on the deck, but we've certainly put in a lot of miles and had very limited opportunities to get that. So looking forward to times to come where hopefully we do get a few more opportunities and just being able to learn from these deer, because that's for me pretty important as well. Like just trying to figure out why they do things and also where they live and especially in these low density environments.
Actually, James, if you can answer me a question from that last scenario of where we viewed those hinds and that hind call got that spiker to come in, I questioned where are all the stags, and you said something about the hinds potentially already being served. And can you elaborate on that?
Oh, and this is just a theory. Like there are probably guys out there that know way more about red deer than me, but I think like what I've found is on this particular place where we're saying like there was 5 hinds that we've sort of seen routinely, and then we end up finding these couple more in a very sort of tucked away hidden basin in a straight line over a hill, probably like 4 or 5 Ks away. But I think a lot of the rutting activity for me, and I was seeing a lot more stags before these guys actually got here, between like the 20th to 25th of March on these places where we had a fair few more stags coming through. And since then, and especially since our time in South East Queensland, like other than Ayden's stag, we've seen a couple of other younger stags, but like the number of stags that we've seen have been really low, and the rutting activity has been really low. And I just wonder if that's because a lot of these hinds got bred, just say between the 20th of March and the 1st of April, and then the stags have actually gone off looking for other hinds, considering how low the density is. And that's the thing, like I've only been hunting these places now for a couple of months, so I don't really know the cyclic pattern of these stags, but that's what my sort of hypothesis was. And so I'm curious to see if these stags come back at all during the winter period. Like I have a little bit of suspicion that they will, just from what the cockies say about, seeing stags in May, June and July and stuff on crop. Especially oats and stuff, which obviously get reds in trouble a little bit, being such large animals and smashing oat crops. But I'm curious to see if I can pattern them through these winter months and whether they come back. And I think, just to answer Dad's question, the reason why the stags weren't with them and the spiker was just with them was because they'd been bred. But once again, that's just my sort of observation and hypothesis. Like it may be completely different, and there just wasn't a stag there on that day, and there, just given the low density of the situation, he was else there looking for girls, and a stag might have been with him the next day. Who's to know and say?
Yeah, I remember having this slightly ominous feel, I guess, when we had just experienced that morning when 3 stags were roaring, and it was by far our most action-packed in New South Wales. When we saw Clubby, we had that other stag call responding to our hind calls, and then we saw that young 6x7 and had some really good encounters with him as he was following that hind around. And she was definitely in estrus, I'd say, because she was a bit flirtatious, would stand there for him, and he was roaring. And again, not a mature stag or anything like that, but definitely he was courting her to try and breed her and stuff. And I remember that was quite early on in the piece, and I remember thinking, geez, we're sort of leaving at a real tricky time, because that was the first time we'd really heard any stags roaring in New South Wales. And then interestingly, if we were away for a week in Queensland, and if you've got 5 hinds that come on, some in the same day, others might be a day separated, with only 5 or 6 hinds, assumingly, on this property, even if you say there's 10, there's probably a maximum of 10 days that there's hinds in estrus, knowing that, they'll repeat their cycle every 21 days if they're not bred, and then they're obviously going to be in estrus for, up to a 24-hour period. So in saying that, like I remember James had mentioned it to me quite a lot, which I already obviously knew, but it was interesting to hear it. That might give you 10 days of roaring at max, but there is most likely a chance that, there's going to be a hind cycling over there and a hind cycling over here and a hind cycling over here on the same day. So there's 3 out of your potential 10 hinds that, you're going to get stags roaring if there's spikers in there as well, or if there's more stags trying to breed with those hinds. So again, that's why I think, coming back to this low density and the fact that we really only got 1 day of good roaring, and then the day that my stag roared was an anomaly. And again, because of that spiker, we were able to luck out on it essentially. we basically had 2 days of roaring in New South Wales for, a whole lot of time hunting it. Ozcaf Energy helps you power your passion. Designed to be convenient, discreet and portable with rapid energy absorption, these caffeine pouches are centered around adventure. With added benefits such as 0 calories and 0 sugar, what's not to love? Use code TWINELEMENTS for 10% off your next order.
Well, legends, that wraps up our Red Deer podcast. We hope you guys have a few takeaway and lessons from those stories. And once again, congratulations to Ayden for shooting a truly magnificent red stag, a once-in-a-lifetime stag. And congratulations to me for capturing some awesome footage of it to share with you guys, because I cannot wait. Like, one of my goals for this year personally was to get some really good rutting footage of red stags, because it was actually I filmed Nick Morton a couple of years ago in Argentina, where we had some really, really special encounters and obviously got a fantastic stag on the deck, but we'd never actually done a film in Australia hunting red deer, and it was something I was really passionate about and really wanted to get this year. And we've done that. We've gone out and got 3 really good stags on film. I think the closest shot was Ayden's stag in South East Queensland, which was 7 meters, and the furthest shot that we took was Ayden's stag, the big boy, here in the Hunter Valley, where it was about 20 meters. And I think the furthest stag that ran was probably mine, that went maybe 60 meters or something like that. So we've been up close and personal with a lot of stags. Like, we would have called in over, I don't know, maybe 30 or so, and also got seen and got footage of, I don't even know, too many to count. It's been an incredible rut. Like, learnt a lot as always, and just really compounded some of our calling strategies and whatnot. Like I was saying before, like, I think we've really capitalized on the opportunities that we've had, and also got some really cool footage that we can't wait to share with you guys. But what we're going to do is jump into our FAQ section now. So if anyone has any questions that they want answered, whether it be to do with gear or the rut, please send an email to info@twinelements.com.au with the subject line FAQ. Equally, send us a message at Twin Elements on Instagram, or Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors, and we will get to them as soon as possible on a future podcast episode. We are a bit inundated, and so we may do a future Q&A, explicit podcast in the future, just because we have been getting so many questions. But keep sending them in. We will stockpile them and we will get to them as soon as we can. This week's question was sent in by Tom Quinn. Hey gents, I'm on a property in New South Wales. It has fallow deer and red deer. I've been hunting here since Saturday and have only seen 1 red spiker and a fallow doe. The weather is still very warm here, 20 degrees as I send this. Is it possible that the rut hasn't started here due to the warmer weather, or is it more likely that the property doesn't hold the numbers for an obvious rut to occur? Thanks for your help, fellas.
Well, Tom, welcome to the party. This basically sounds like what we've just experienced personally here in New South Wales. And to be honest, again, we know the deer have been rutting. The stag I shot had snapped off most of his tines in places on his right-hand side antler. So we know that he's obviously been fighting over something. We also know that with red deer and fallow deer in particular, that they, with the shortening day length and duration of sunlight hours, as the days shorten, they basically start to come into season and go into their estrus. So we know that that's more lined up with a date period, which coincides with the end of March, start of April, rather than weather. And as we've discussed on previous fallow deer podcasts and discussing the biology as to why they rut and how they rut and what factors affect the does and things like that, we know that whilst weather, temperature, environmental conditions can play a slight role on affecting that, we know that, more so the time of year actually affects, the rut intensity. But it definitely could be, I think you've hit the nail on the head. You could be in an area with low deer density. And to be honest, between James and I, we consider ourselves pretty experienced hunters. We consider ourselves bloody hardworking when it comes to hunting, trying to find the animals. We get up there at first light. Before first light, we hike up in the dark. For that example with Clubby, that stag we saw earlier, if we were there 5 minutes later, we would not have seen him cross, from our property onto the other side of the boundary fence and then disappear. Like, we just would not have seen that and not experienced a 14-point red stag. We would have missed him and then, potentially not even seen a deer that day. So the fact that we were up there early, covering, the miles on foot and on glass, allowed us to experience and find that stag. So I'm not saying that you're not doing that, but it does definitely pay to obviously try and stack up the days that you can hunt this property, doing so at different times of the day, even hunting it a certain way in the morning and then trying to hunt out a gully or a different ridge or check out a different dam on the way back to the car for the middle of the day could help just turn up some numbers. But I'm sure James has something to add as well.
Yeah, I definitely can speak to like the different route, and like in a lot of ways, like Ayden said, we probably wouldn't have got his red stag if we hadn't gone a different route home. Only an extra couple of 100 meters. But yeah, just to go and check out a dam. And I'm like very much just like, I would rather bush bash through an area and put up deer and go and see sign, but go and walk a new area on the way home because I just want to know what's there and I want to see what's there. And there's only one way in my mind of like doing that, and that's either sitting on the side of the hill looking into there or in a lot of senses just going and walking there and seeing what signs there. And if you don't go there, you just never know. And then you end up hunting the same spots. And I see it so often where people have a large parcel of land, but they only do a couple of hunts. And then there's really good places that they've just never been to. And so I think, just doing a lot of work and like what Ayden said, like we create opportunities through hard work. Like we are, I'd like to think, decent hunters. But I'd also know that we work very, very, very hard. And we put in the miles, to try and generate these opportunities. But from the sounds of it, mate, I just think with yours, and I remember answering the question and having a bit of a follow-up where, we spoke about trying to concentrate on good feed areas and definitely spoke about how warmer weather may have been affecting the rutting activity, but saying how they're definitely still going to be rutting. And I remember you saying that, you moved and checked out some new feed areas and ended up seeing a couple more deer and a couple more bucks. But just talking about especially those lower density sort of environments, as Ayden and I have become very familiar with, and how, if there is only 5 or 10 does in this whole area that you're hunting, well, that does give a very limited amount of days where you're going to see that sort of rutting activity with croaks and stuff like that. And even then they may not go very hard. And so that's sort of what we pinpointed it down to. And it was actually a thing where he reckons that the cocky sees a lot more deer sort of the winter months, and what actually happens is a lot of them move off when the rut happens. And so we actually just spoke about and saying, hey mate, it might be best to come back in sort of June or something like that, or end of May, and just see what animals have come back during the rut, or out of the rut periods, I should say, and have come back in. And maybe it's just because the farmer has a crop in, or there's better feed there, or they lock up a certain bit of the property. But yeah, he was going to come back and check it out outside the rut, but not to say that we didn't encourage him to keep putting in the miles and putting in the work, hopefully during the rut, to get a good buck or a good stag.
The next question has been sent in by Will Palmer, and he says, hey boys, just wanted to ask a question. I had some good responses to my croaking from the same buck last night and this morning, but he would only give out a couple of croaks and then would go quiet after I responded back with a couple. The wind was in my favour. I just wasn't quite sure what made him go quiet.
So this happens pretty commonly with bucks, and I guess the first thing that I would think about is when during the rut sort of period this is all occurring, because if it's earlier on in the rut, he may only just be starting to sort of feel his testosterone coming in and stuff, where he might croak, but he's not in that full crazy rutting mode. But generally speaking, bucks are croaking to sort of call in does and also just warn as a territorial display other bucks to say, piss off, mate, this is my bit of a turf. So if you're croaking and he's croaking, he may be just, like I said, like not fully feeling the rut at that stage, and that's maybe why he, he doesn't just keep on croaking. But generally speaking, what I would actually try and do, mate, is once you've sort of located where he is, like he's most likely going to be hanging on a scrape, especially if you've done it for an afternoon and a morning. You've clearly located him to a specific area. I would then actually proceed and try and close the gap, and then actually try and like do some doe calls and actually get him. He'd probably respond with some croaks, but equally probably get him to come in. So I'm not sure if you're a rifle hunter or a bow hunter, Will, but I reckon even in thick bush, whether it be either weapon of choice, like you should have pretty good success doe calling him in. And if you find it a nice little spot, maybe 100 meters off where you think he is, and just give out a couple of doe calls, well, worst case scenario, he might not do anything. He probably would give out a couple of croaks, and then best case scenario, he's probably going to come towards you looking for this doe call. So fingers crossed you can, fingers crossed now that we've answered this question, you can have a bit of luck and get him on the ground. But I think, being able to locate him with a couple of croaks and then get in and do some doe calls is probably going to be your best chance. And not knowing exactly when this question got sent in, I think he's probably just not feeling, the rut fully yet, and that's why he's not croaking wild and crazy and stuff. But it could also be to do with deer densities. Like if there's not a lot of deer there, and especially not a lot of does, then he may not be going to experience that full, where you just croak and croak and croak, like what they do in that high density situation.
Rightio, that wraps it up for our FAQ section today and also our podcast. So thank you very much to all of you guys who support us and have listened. We hope you guys have loved the past 3 Red Deer Raw podcasts that have been very heavily themed towards the rut. We want to hear from you guys and girls that listen to this podcast on what future topics you want us to discuss. We obviously have a bit of a list and some of the topics that we're going to be working through over the coming weeks to months, but also want to cover what you guys deem as important to, the Australian hunting industry, New Zealand hunting industry, whatever it may be, and cover topics that are going to be relatable to you guys who are our greater audience. We obviously understand that we've smashed the Rut and Raw podcasts of late, and we do have one Fallow Deer podcast coming out next week. But we also want to cover, obviously, what's going on here in Australia and New Zealand, whether that be, gear guides, chittle deer or deer specific podcasts. We had someone message in and say, can you guys compile a list of, 10 guides or outfitting opportunities that you have either experienced or think are really good here in Australia. So that's something that we can definitely do and think that's going to obviously benefit you guys, which are our greater audience. So again, if you want to send an email through to us at info@twinelements.com.au with the subject outline topic, or just simply send us a DM. That seems to be the easiest for these sorts of things where people are most confident. Just send us through a podcast topic, and again, we'll compile them, and the ones that seem to get the most interest we'll obviously try and prioritize and do a little bit sooner.
Well, if you have been living under a rock, then you haven't heard about our YouTube 20K subscriber giveaway. But I figure most of you, our loyal listeners, would have already commented on our Northern Territory highlight reel and be in the draw to win this incredibly generous giveaway worth thousands of dollars that brands that we work closely with have put together. So what you need to do, if you haven't entered, is jump onto our YouTube channel and find our Northern Territory bow hunting highlight reel video. It's a couple-minute video of action-packed, awesome footage compiled together. And you need to comment with 25 words or less saying where you would like to hunt and what you would like to hunt for. Then you go in the draw to win a pair of lower boots, an option sight, a day 6 knife, as well as some arrows, some Koga broadheads and apparel, some OzCap energy pouches, an Atlas Wild and Dog and Gun care package, a Kimbo rolling knife sharpener, as well as plenty of gear from Venture Hunting and Outdoors. So make sure to comment and jump in on that giveaway. We're nearly at the 20K subscriber mark, so it will be drawn shortly. So all the legends that have already jumped on and commented, we really appreciate your support, and hopefully one of you lucky listeners is going to win it in the future.
Please continue to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast. It honestly means the world to us, and James and I really appreciate the support that we're getting on this. Again, we see all of your story shares, all of the comments on Spotify, all these sorts of things, and absolutely appreciate everything that you guys are doing for us trying to grow this outdoor community. We're obviously putting in a lot of work to it. Like we're doing a late night here while we're out trying to hunt fallow deer. It's nearly 10 p.m. and we've got to get up tomorrow morning at 3:30 to go and hunt, hopefully croaking bucks. It's our first day here, but we're doing it for you guys as much as we are doing it for ourselves. And again, without the feedback and the support, it would be something that we're not interested in. So again, you guys are keep fueling us. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you very, very much. And we really hope you enjoyed this recap from our Red Deer Raw. Like I've honestly loved talking about it. I get warm and fuzzy, doing this with my best mate, my brother, and being able to revisit and obviously stockpile some of the stories and encounters and stuff that we've been able to do over the years. And I really look forward to doing that into the future as well.
Thanks, legends, and we'll catch you on a future episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Cheers.